Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
One of the things that the COVID pandemic brought, and I remember this from the beginning of the pandemic, is that it brought a lot of filings for divorce, of all things, and maybe it shouldn't be surprising, but there were a lot of divorce filings as a result of the pandemic. And I remember it was in the early days of the pandemic, before it really even hit the United States. It was still pretty much in China, and the Chinese officials were indicating that there were a lot of divorce filings as a result of the pandemic. And so that got me thinking a little bit about, okay, divorce, and when do most divorces happen? So I did some research. Most, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for some reason they keep track of these statistics, the number of divorces in the United States tend to peak during the months of March and August. And that pattern has been observed over many years and certainly is attributable to many factors. But what they surmise is that in March, some couples might be holding out until after the holiday seasons to file for divorce. They don't want to disrupt the family gatherings during the holidays, so they're just going to, put on a happy face and muscle through the holidays, get through the holidays. But then by March, they're like, okay, enough. Holidays were fun, but it wasn't good leading into it. It was okay going through it, but enough. And similarly in August, couples, nobody knows for sure. People file divorce for all sorts of reasons. But what they surmise is that people hold off filing divorce until August because they don't want to ruin their summer vacation plans or give the kids, if there's kids involved, this sense of instability during the summer months. Get into the school year, there's a little more stability in their going to school, and I don't know, just again, this is what they surmise. Lots of reasons for why somebody would file divorce, and I'm gonna bring this all back to networking, trust me. So then I wanted to kind of look into cases of domestic violence, and domestic violence is certainly up during times of like the holiday season, financial difficulties, job loss. What they find is that around the holidays in the summer months, there's more domestic violence, and you'd think it had to do with the weather, maybe hot weather, but what they say, or again, what they surmise is that there is an increase in alcohol consumption at social gatherings, and in summertime you have a lot more social gatherings, and alcohol consumption exasperates existing tensions and tends to lead to more violent behavior. So very interesting. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised, and we've seen this in the United States, that the COVID lockdown has led to more divorce filings, relationships just not working out. And what got me thinking on all of this is there was an article that came through the PsyBlog newsletter, and the article was "Why Stress Kills Relationships and What to Do About It." And probably title this podcast something similar. If you've been around this podcast a while, you will know that I often will say that as humans, we have one brain. God gave us one brain, and there's not a special compartment for professional relationships. Relationships are relationships. Your personal relationships are very similar in nature to your professional relationships. And often when I talk to people relative to how to become more successful with their relationships, and they're, well, what should I do? I always throw it back at them in terms of their personal relationships. What would you do in this case in a personal relationship? And generally speaking, the answer is there. Or vice versa. If I'm talking to somebody about their personal relationship, I might get them to reflect upon what they would do in a business relationship, in a professional relationship. And oftentimes the answer is there. So at any rate, why does stress kill relationships? And stress is a horrible thing. I think we all need stress. I shouldn't say it's a horrible thing. Too much of certain types of stress is a horrible thing. I find that some stress is good, some stress is energizing. If there were no stress at all, we would just be lying around in bed all day. But we get up, we go to work, and there's a stress to going to work. Even if you like your job, there's a stress to it. It's just part of life. It's just part of, it's just part of what we need to deal with. But there is a point where stress can be almost debilitating. I have had phases where I have just been so stressed, I can't think about what the next thing to do. What should I do next? And often I find it's stress coupled with being tired. If I'm well rested and stressed, I'm better able to deal with it. But if I'm really tired, end of a long week, and I'm stressed, I just don't know what to do. I'll go to bed, get some sleep. And I find that I'm able to sort things out. Yeah, okay, it's obvious I need to do this. It's obvious, the issue's clearly here. It's not as bad as I thought. I'm going to kind of triage my problems, figure out what's the most important. Not everything needs to be dealt with. Sometimes we stress over things that are, they're important, but they're, 2 months out. Okay, I've got time to deal with it. Every year I extend my tax returns. I might still get them done on time, but I find if I file that extension, I know I've got an extra 6 months, and it just takes a layer of stress off. Just as one example. But why does stress kill relationships? This debilitating stress. And what they found is that people under stress take much more notice of their partner's negative behaviors. And again, when you're dealing with personal relationships or professional relationships, these same sorts of things apply. So you have a spouse and things are stressful, you're going to notice things about that spouse. Little things that, when you might be dating are cute and you just let them go by. But in a moment of stress, and being in a marriage, having a family can be stressful. There's lots of moving parts. Those things become a little annoying, or you might start noticing things that you didn't notice before, and those things start to become annoying. And they talk about in the article that it's it's not a single day of stress. This is stress taken over a long period of time, and that's where the pandemic comes in, right? The pandemic, you've got a lockdown. The lockdown wasn't a day, it wasn't 2 weeks, it wasn't even 2 months really. Arguably, it went on for 2 years, depending upon where you're at. And there was a huge change in how we dealt with one another during the pandemic. All my kids were home. They just the way it worked out. My youngest was still in college. My daughter was trying to find a job. My son was living down in Miami, but his apartment lease was up, and he's like, "Why? I can work remote. Why am I spending rent down here when I could just be at home?" So there was a lot going on. There's a lot of stress. There's just the stress of what's next. There's the stress of what's for dinner. Is there food? Just all those sorts of things that you don't normally run into. And so there are stresses there, but then there are stresses in business too, our professional lives. We have stresses related to, how are we doing on sales, expenses that come out of nowhere. I mean, they tend to mirror what's going on in your personal life. There are just certain things we don't have control over. and those things tend to stress us out. And so when you're under stress, you'll be looking at the people around you, and you're fixated on their negative attributes. One of the authors of the study, Dr. Lisa Neff, she said, I'll quote her. Quote, we found that individuals who reported experiencing more stressful life events outside of their relationships, such as problems at work, were especially likely to notice if their partner behaved in an inconsiderate manner, unquote. Um, very true. I have franchisees. For the most part, I have a great relationship with franchisees. Um, Times of stress, there's tensions there. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, or I'm not saying I'm innocent. I'm not saying I'm to blame. I'm not saying they're innocent or to blame. We're just different people, and things become stressful. And what they did in this study is they looked at 79 heterosexual couples. They were tracked over 10 days. And it's interesting, these couples were newlyweds. And you'd think newlyweds would have these, they'd be in the honeymoon phase, right? And they would overlook negative actions and just focus on the positive, but that wasn't the case. And that stress just affects us all. And when we encounter stress, we just start to look. It's just kind of the human condition. We start to look for the bad things in other people, the things that drive us crazy, that otherwise really don't matter. And so, the purpose of this particular episode is just to point out that stress is an important factor in our relationships. It it does impact it does impact them. It can have a negative impact on them. And so some of the things we can do about it is, one, certainly knowing that it's an issue, knowing that, what, the relationship I have with my kids or my wife or whatever is probably pretty damn good, and anything that's happening right now is just stress. I've always, as long as I've been working, of course, I was a tax consultant for a number of years. January, February, March, April it's just been a stressful time for us. When I say us, my wife and I, she works a job. There's a lot going on in that first quarter of the year, first 3 or 4 months. There's just a lot going on. And it just starts to ease up in the summer months. Of course, that we had kids in school, and it was just a lot there. So I've, looking back, I noticed those things, and things were just, you were always a little more irritable. And it's just kind of the same thing in the working world. There's a lot going on in these early months. So, for me, it's just recognizing, okay, I'm stressed. One of my franchisees, Tom Anderson, he has been around me for 20 years now, and he says, I know not to call you before the leadership conference. And well, Matt Ward said the same thing. Matt Ward's known me 2 years, or 3 years at this point. You get stressed, and I do. There's a lot. Once a year we have a leadership conference. It's usually in early February. There's a lot that goes into these things. We used to do them in person, which made them less stressful in certain circumstances and more stressful in others. But now we do them online, and there's still a lot of stresses. I won't get into it all, and it just builds up inside me. And I just need to recognize that's a stressful time. Okay, what do I need to do? Every year to year, I'm always asking myself, what do I need to do to minimize the stress? Because the stress doesn't help my relationships at all. So that's probably the first thing we can do, is just stop and say, okay, is this real, or is it just stress magnifying how I feel about somebody or the things that they're doing? And if you can do that, if you can go ahead and try and figure that stuff out, then you can take a deeper breath. You can do things to minimize the stress. Once you acknowledge, hey, it's just stressful, and you can kind of laugh about it, and you're probably better off than you think. When I had interviewed Trish Perry on the podcast, she talked about her amygdala being hijacked. And your brain goes through this sequence of it tells itself a story, the worst possible things that are likely going to happen. And once you engage the neocortex, the higher thinking part of the brain, and just say, okay, all right, it's stress. Is it really that bad? And if it's really that bad, what can I do to fix it? If it's not really that bad, then just take a deep breath and, not worry about it so much. Just understanding that if you let it fester and fester, it's going to impair your relationships. And I see it every year. I see it from time to time. I would like to say I'm smart enough to know that I just need to not engage with people. I'm better at it. If I'm having a bad day, I might not answer the phone, the office phone, or I just, I'll sit on emails and just, I'll write a draft response and then look at it later. Those are all the things. But the point of this whole episode is that stress is a killer of your relationships. Maybe not a killer, maybe that's just overblown. But it certainly can impair your relationships, personal and professional, from being the best they can possibly be. So you need to manage stress, manage the things you're dealing with. Don't take too much on. But then also manage how you deal with stress, because that's another important aspect of having good relationships, again, personal or professional.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.